The morning mist clung to the surface of the river Main, softening the outlines of the bridges and the silhouettes of the barges. The city awoke not with a jolt, but with a gradual, familiar murmur. The scent of freshly baked bread from a bakery on the Romaberg mixed with the damp, earthy smell of the cobblestones, still cool from the night. In the Altstadt, the heart of Frankfurt, the day began in the embrace of centuries. The sun, climbing above the gabled roofs, caught the intricate patterns of the half-timbered houses. Each building was a unique testament to time, its dark, wooden beams forming a crazed geometry against the white and pastel-colored plaster. This was the largest collection of such structures in all of Germany, a dense, living forest of wood and stone. Washing hung from lines strung between ornate oriel windows, and the faint sound of a piano lesson drifted from an open casement. A postman made his rounds, his leather bag slapping rhythmically against his hip as he nodded to the shopkeeper who was unrolling his awning. The clatter of a tram on Zale was a distant, modern counterpoint to the clip-clop of a horse-drawn cart delivering coal. On the square, children chased a ball, their shouts echoing off the facades of the medieval townhouses and the grand, Gothic bulk of the St. Bartholomew's Cathedral. Its emperor's bell, the Glockkaiser, was silent, waiting for a coronation that would not come again. Life unfolded in the shadow of these architectural heirlooms. An old woman swept the step of a house that had survived the 30 Years' War. A young man, rushing to work, glanced up at the carved wooden figures supporting the eaves, a grinning gargoyle, a stern saint. They were part of the scenery, unnoticed guardians of a daily life that felt permanent, immutable. In the small workshops, craftsmen bent over their benches, the sounds of their labor, the tap of a hammer, the whir of a lathe, a quiet hum of industry that had nothing to do with war. The city was a complete universe. Its cobblestone lanes were not just streets, they were the veins of a living organism, leading to bustling markets, quiet courtyards, and cozy beer gardens where the air would soon be thick with the smell of roasting sausages and tobacco. There was no sense of an ending. No premonition of the storm gathering in the drawing rooms of distant powers. The sky above Frankfurt was a benign, endless blue, traversed only by clouds and the occasional bird. The city, in its timeless beauty, was blind to the future. It did not know that in the war rooms of the Allies, its name was already being circled on maps, its historic center not a treasure to be preserved, but a target to be erased. The foundations of the houses, laid deep in the earth over hundreds of years, did not tremble. They slept. And the city dreamed on, a magnificent, unaware jewel, waiting for the fall of the first hammer. The blue had gone. It was replaced by a ceiling of impenetrable gray, a featureless expanse of cloud that stretched from horizon to horizon. This was the weather of a new era, not the crisp, clear skies of peacetime, but the shrouded, ominous overcast of war. On the ground, in Frankfurt, life had acquired a new, grim rhythm. The cheerful awnings were gone, replaced by blackout curtains. The sound of children playing in the Romaberg was a memory. The square was now crisscrossed with anti-tank barriers and dotted with piles of sandbags. Their half-timbered houses, once so vibrant, now looked like anxious old men, their windows blinded by tape to prevent shattering. The air no longer carried the scent of bread, but the acrid smell of coal smoke and a pervasive, low-level fear. The city was no longer sleeping, it was holding its breath. High above this grim tableau, suspended in the roaring, vibrating cold, men strained to see what the weather had hidden. The interiors of the British bombers were a world of their own, a cacophony of engine noise, rushing wind, and the static hiss of radios. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, high-octane fuel, and ozone. These were not the vast armadas that would come later, but a smaller, determined force on a critical mission. The success of this raid, one of the first major coordinated efforts against a deep inland target like Frankfurt, hinged on a new, sophisticated tool, the radio. The plan, championed by the ambitious Vice Marshal Don Bennett, was a testament to a new kind of warfare, one fought with wavelengths and precision as much as with bombs and bullets. Inside one lead aircraft, the bomb aimer lay prone in the nose, his face pressed against the cold glass, seeing nothing but a sea of cloud. The pilot's hands, encased in thick gloves, gripped the controls, fighting turbulence. And in the radio operator's seat, a man named Squadron Leader C.P. Daniels put on his headset. His role was simple, yet monumentally critical. He was the shepherd. His voice, broadcast on the standard beam approach frequency, was to be the guiding signal, the invisible string that would lead the entire flock to the target and, just as importantly, coordinate their release. He was the linchpin upon which the entire operation turned. Down in Frankfurt, the air raid sirens began their slow, rising wail. It was a sound that now punctuated daily life, a sound that sent a jolt of adrenaline through every citizen. People moved with a practiced, weary haste, descending into cellars and bunkers that had become their second homes. They huddled in the damp, electric light, their faces etched with a tension that was becoming permanent. They listened, not to the bombers yet, but to the silence that followed the sirens. In these moments, the fate of the city felt like it hung in the balance, subject to the whims of distant men and machines. Back in the lead bomber, squadron leader Daniels began to speak. His voice was calm, professional, reciting the coordinates, the approach vector, the final countdown. But as his words left his mouth, they did not travel cleanly through the ether to his waiting fleet. Instead, they met the same weather system that blanketed the city. A wall of atmospheric interference, a crackling, popping storm of static, swallowed his transmission whole. The sophisticated radio, the pride of the bomber command, became a useless piece of metal. His voice, the crucial guiding signal, was broken, fragmented, and lost. To the pilots and bomb aimers in the other aircraft, their headsets filled only with meaningless noise, a chaotic hiss that offered no guidance, no comfort, no command. What followed was not a cataclysm, but a fiasco. The formation, blinded by cloud and deafened by static, began to break up. Some pilots, flying on instinct and a desperate desire to complete their mission, pressed on for a few more minutes, hoping for a break in the weather that never came. Others, realizing the futility, began the slow, wide turn that would take them home. A handful of bombs were released, scattered blindly across the countryside and the outer industrial districts of Frankfurt. The explosions that shook the city that night were sporadic. Isolated thumps, not the concentrated drumbeat of destruction. A farmhouse on the outskirts was destroyed. A railway siding was damaged. In the Oldstadt, the ancient, wooden heart of the city, the damage was limited to a few blown-out windows from the distant concussions. As the all-clear siren sounded, a sound of profound relief mixed with a strange, unsettling disappointment swept through the shelters. The people emerged, blinking, into the night. The city still stood. The Romaberg was intact. The cathedral spire still pierced the sky. They had been spared. But there was no celebration. The reprieve felt temporary, a stay of execution. They had felt the breath of the dragon, had heard the rustle of its wings, even if its fire had not yet fallen. The attack of December 2, 1942, was logged as a failure. The official reports would cite poor weather and equipment malfunction. For the Allies, it was a setback, a lesson in the limitations of technology. For the citizens of Frankfurt, it was something far more sinister. It was a warning, a final, unequivocal demonstration that their city was no longer just a place on a map, but a target in a crosshair. The first strike had missed, but it had shattered the last illusion of safety. The storm had not arrived, but everyone now knew, with a chilling certainty, that it was coming. The silence that followed the failed December raid was more terrifying than the bombs themselves. It was a silence filled with anticipation, a collective holding of breath that stretched through the winter and into the spring of 1943. In Frankfurt, life became a grim pantomime conducted under the ever-present threat of the siren. The initial, almost grateful relief had curdled into a deep-seated anxiety. The enemy had shown its face, however briefly, and had then retreated. Everyone knew it would return. The only questions were when, and in what form. The answer came from a different direction, both literally and figuratively. It did not arrive under the cloak of night, with the sinister, droning hum of the British RAF. It came in the stark, unforgiving light of day. On October 4, 1943, the sky to the west began to hum, a sound that grew from a distant vibration into a deep, chest-rattling thunder. People spilled into the streets, not heading for shelters, but staring upward, their hands shielding their eyes. What they saw was not a formation of aircraft, it was a geometric phenomenon. A precise, grid-like armada of machines, flying in a tight, disciplined formation that seemed to defy the very chaos of war. These were not the dark, predatory shapes of the night raiders, these were silver, gleaming fortresses, moving with an almost serene, terrible purpose. They were the B-17 flying fortresses of the United States' 1st Bombardment Wing. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. The night raids were acts of terror, a brutal, anonymous pounding from a hidden foe. This was different. This was a statement. It was a cold, clinical demonstration of industrial power, a declaration that the war had entered a new, more terrifying phase. The Americans believed in precision. They flew by day, relying on the advanced Norden bombsight to surgically strike critical nodes in the German war machine. Their target that day was not the picturesque Altstadt, not the homes of civilians, but the Vereinigte Deutsche Metallwerk, the United German Metal Works, in the industrial suburb of Heidenheim. This was their arsenal of democracy flexing its muscle, aiming to cripple the enemy's ability to fight by severing its industrial tendons. Inside the lead fortress, the world was a study in controlled chaos and frigid tension. The roar of four Wright cyclone engines was a physical force, vibrating through the aluminum skin of the aircraft, into the seats, and into the bones of the 10-man crew. The air at 25,000 feet was lethally cold, a dry ice that seeped through electrically heated suits and made exposed skin stick to metal. The interior smelled of aviation fuel, cordite from the test-fired machine guns, and the faint, metallic scent of pure oxygen flowing from masks. Below, through the plexiglass nose, the bomb aimer lay prone, his world reduced to the crosshairs of his bomb sight. The city of Frankfurt was a detailed map, a mosaic of grey and brown, the serpentine line of the main river his primary landmark. His voice, calm and monotone, crackled over the intercom, directing the pilot with minute adjustments. Left, left, steady, steady. The fate of the factory, and the lives of those working within it, were now subject to his concentration and the whims of the wind. On the ground, the response was a frantic, desperate fury. The air raid sirens, now a familiar sound of dread, wailed across Heidenheim. But for the workers at the metalworks, there was no deep, safe cellar. The factory's own anti-aircraft batteries, the flak, opened up. The sky around the pristine American formation began to erupt in ugly, black smudges of smoke. The air, once just filled with engine thunder, was now with the concussions of exploding shells. Shrapnel tinkled, a deadly rain, against the fuselages of the fortresses. For the bomber crews, this was their flak happy hour, a trial by fire they had to endure, holding their formation, flying straight and level into the heart of the storm to give their bomb aimer a stable platform. It was a terrifying, deafening gauntlet. A direct hit would turn a fortress into a falling star of molten metal and fuel, with no chance of survival for its crew. Then came the moment of release. From the bowels of 155 B-17s, the bombs fell away. It was not a single sound, but a sequence, the mechanical clunk of the bomb bay doors opening, a sudden upward lurch of the aircraft as thousands of pounds of weight were relinquished, and then the whistle. A high-pitched, descending shriek that grew in volume and number until it became a singular, soul-scraping chorus of impending doom. For those on the ground, looking up, the sky itself seemed to be falling, a swarm of dark, slender shapes growing larger with terrifying speed. The impact was not the indiscriminate firestorm of a night raid, but a concentrated, tectonic hammer blow. The earth shuddered. The initial detonations were massive, single concussions that vaporized buildings at the epicenter. Then secondary explosions erupted as stored materials and munitions within the factory cooked off, sending fireballs and shrapnel tearing through the surrounding structures. The sound was not just heard, it was felt in the viscera, a physical pressure that compressed lungs and rattled teeth. A wave of superheated air and dust swept through the streets, blowing out windows a mile away and knocking people off their feet. The Vereinigte Deutsche Metallwerk, a key cog in the German war machine, was being systematically dismantled from 25,000 feet. When the last B-17 turned for home, leaving the flak and the fighters behind, the sky was stained with smoke and the contrails of the departing armada. The silence that returned was different from the one before. It was a stunned, broken silence, punctuated by the crackle of flames, the screams of the trapped and the wounded, and the distant bells of fire engines. The Americans had, by their own metrics, succeeded. They had hit their target with devastating effect. But precision was a relative term from 5 miles up. The bombs that missed the sprawling factory complex had fallen on the workers' housing, on schools, on shops. The collateral damage was immense. The raid on October 4th was important. It proved that the Americans had the range, the technology, and the will to bring the war to Germany's industrial heart in broad daylight. The failure of December was a forgotten memory. The first, successful strike had landed. The era of strategic, industrial annihilation had begun, and Frankfurt was squarely in its sights. The city now knew its enemies wore two different faces, one that attacked in the anonymous dark, and another that delivered destruction with cold, calculated clarity in the blinding light of day. The precision of the American daylight raid was a clinical shock, a wound inflicted with surgical intent. But it was the night that truly owned the soul of Frankfurt's terror. The day offered horizons, a visible enemy, a sky one could scan. The night offered only a void, a vast, impenetrable blackness that hid an ancient, formless dread. It was in this darkness that the true, brutal weight of the air war settled over the city, a pressure that began long before the first siren wailed, in the slow, sinking dread that accompanied the setting of the sun. As twilight bled away, the city underwent a transformation. It didn't just go dark, it disappeared. The mandatory blackout was absolute, a communal act of self-erasure. Streetlights were dead. Windows were shuttered behind heavy wood or masked with curtains painted tar black. The headlights of the few authorized vehicles were reduced to mere slits of light. Frankfurt became a city of ghosts, its citizens moving through the streets by memory and touch, their world reduced to the faint, treacherous glow of a cigarette or the occasional beam of a warden's flashlight. The familiar was made alien. A simple trip to a neighbor's house became a perilous journey. The city, in its attempt to become invisible, instead became a landscape of shadows and unseen threats, every corner holding potential disaster. High above, in the frigid darkness, the instruments of this terror were approaching. This was not the clean, geometric formation of the Americans. This was a stream, a dark river of aircraft, 162 Avro Lancasters, 170 Handley Page Halifaxes, 70 short Stirlings, a mixed fleet of British bombers converging on their target. They flew alone and yet together, each crew a solitary, terrified universe enclosed in metal, connected to the others only by the same coordinates on a map. Inside a Lancaster, the reality of the mission was a stark contrast to the fortress. The noise was a constant, deafening roar. The cold was a predatory entity, seeping through the layers of leather and wool, frosting the inside of the cockpit canopy. The smell was a unique cocktail of high-octane fuel, sweat, vomit, and the faint, sweet smell of oxygen. The bomb aimer lay in the nose, his face almost pressed to the cold plexiglass, staring into an abyss. There were no city lights to guide him, no neat lines of rivers or streets. His world was the radar screen, a ghostly, greenish glow painting an abstract representation of the world below. He listened for the voice of the master of ceremonies, the Pathfinder aircraft flying ahead, whose job was to find the target and mark it with cascading showers of colored flares, green for initial marking, red for the target point itself. The success of the entire raid, the lives of the airmen, and the destruction of the city below, all hinged on the accuracy of these ghostly markers in the night. For Frankfurt, the first warning was not the siren, but a new sound woven into the familiar drone of engines, a sound like falling candlesticks, a gentle, tinkling cascade. Then, the night would dissolve into a terrible, artificial daylight. The sky would erupt with floating, brilliant flares, Christmas trees, the Germans called them, drifting slowly down on parachutes, illuminating the city in a stark, merciless white light. It was a moment of supreme vulnerability, the city stripped naked from above. In this ghastly illumination, people could see the faces of their loved ones in the shelters, pale with fear, their eyes wide with reflected fire. They could see the dust, long settled, now dancing in the violent light. Then the real Christmas trees would fall, the target markers, glowing a violent, pulsating red, dropped by the pathfinders directly onto the Oldstadt. From that moment, the fate of their historic center was sealed. The main force of bombers, a seemingly endless procession, would then fly over this single, hellish beacon. The whistle of the bombs this time was different from the day raid. It was not a chorus of individual screams, but a continuous, rising shriek that built into a single, overwhelming wall of sound that blocked out all thought, all prayer, all hope. It was the sound of the sky tearing itself apart. The impact was apocalyptic. The high-explosive, cookies, 2,000-pound blockbusters, landed first. Their purpose was not just to destroy, but to eviscerate. They tore open the roofs of the centuries-old half-timbered houses, exposed their wooden skeletons, and blew out their windows, creating a perfect draft. Then came the incendiaries, thousands of them, raining down like deadly firewood. They were small, magnesium-based bombs that burned with an intense, white-hot heat, impossible to extinguish. They fell into the open attics and shattered interiors, onto the exposed beams dry as tinder after centuries. Within minutes, the Oldstadt was not just on fire, it was becoming a furnace. The separate, individual fires began to reach for each other, to merge, to create their own weather system. A firestorm was being born. This was the true weight of the night. It was not just the physical weight of the 12,197 tons of explosives that would eventually fall. It was the psychological weight of the darkness, the helplessness of being hunted by an unseen enemy. It was the physical weight of the atmosphere itself, as the firestorm began to suck the very oxygen out of the air, suffocating those in shelters even as the flames roasted them. It was the crushing weight of history, hearing the beams of a house that had stood since the time of Goethe scream and crackle as they gave way. The British strategy was not precision, it was eradication. They were not cutting tendons, they were burning the entire body. The night of October 4, 1943, was a declaration that the old Frankfurt, the city of wood and dreams, was now a designated kill zone. The weight was immense, and it was only getting heavier. The night of March 22, 1944, began like any other in the long, grim calendar of terror. The sirens wailed their familiar, rising lament. The people of Frankfurt, their movements now automated by routine and dread, filed into their cellars and public bunkers. They carried their small suitcases of treasured possessions, their gas masks, their weary children. There was fear, yes, but it was a stale fear, a constant companion. They had endured raids before. They had heard the bombs fall, felt the concussions, and emerged to find wounds in their city, but never a mortal blow. They did not know that this night was different. They did not know that the architects of their destruction had studied the previous attacks, had learned, and had now perfected the formula for absolute urban annihilation. High above, the Pathfinder aircraft found their mark with a chilling accuracy. The first flares burst open, flooding the Oldstadt in a ghastly, greenish-white luminescence. Then came the red markers, falling not on the periphery, not on a factory, but directly onto the dense, historic heart of the city. They were like a surgeon's scalpel pointing directly at a cancerous organ, except the intent was not to save the body, but to kill it. The main force of bombers, a stream of darkness and noise, began its slow, relentless pass over this single, hellish bullseye. The first wave of bombs were the blockbusters, 4,000-pound high-explosive cookies. They did not just explode, they disemboweled. Their concussions were physical waves of pressure that hit the chest like a giant's fist. A blockbuster landing on the Romaberg did not merely damage the surrounding half-timbered houses, it vaporized the very ground they stood on, creating a crater that swallowed centuries of history in an instant. The ancient cobblestones were pulverized into dust. The foundations of the town hall, the Roma, groaned and cracked. The stained glass windows of the cathedral, which had filtered sunlight for hundreds of years, were blown inward in a glittering, deadly shower. The blockbusters were the sledgehammer, their purpose to smash open the city, to rip apart its skin and expose its flammable, wooden guts to the air. Then came the incendiaries. They fell not in dozens, not in hundreds, but in tens of thousands. A rain of slender, magnesium sticks, each one a self-contained sun. They clattered onto roofs, punched through the holes torn by the high explosives, and littered the streets. At first, they were individual points of light, flickering in the chaos. But within minutes, they found their fuel: the splintered, centuries-old dry timber of the patchwork houses, the furniture, the books, the very fabric of life. A single incendiary could turn a home into a torch. 1,000 of them, concentrated in a few city blocks, created something new and unholy. The separate fires began to reach for one another. They merged, first into streets of fire, then into entire quarters. The heat became unimaginable, a force in itself. It melted the lead in the church windows and caused the cobblestones in the streets to glow a dull, demonic red. And then the fire began to breathe. The superheated air above the inferno rose with such violent force that it created a massive vacuum at its center. Cold air from the outskirts of the city and from the river was sucked in at hurricane speeds to feed the blaze. This was the birth of the firestorm. The sound changed. The discrete noises of explosions and collapsing buildings were swallowed by a single, continuous, roaring howl, the sound of the storm itself. It was the sound of 1,000 locomotives screaming in unison. For those trapped in the shelters, the world above ceased to be a place of bombs and became a living, breathing monster. The howling wind ripped doors from their hinges and tore people trying to flee off their feet, sucking them into the flames. The air in the deeper bunkers grew thin and foul as the firestorm consumed all available oxygen. People gasped, their lungs burning, clawing at their own throats. They were not being burned, they were being suffocated by the atmosphere itself, drowned on dry land. Those who dared to emerge from their cellars into this hellscape witnessed a vision of the apocalypse. The wind was a physical wall, a torrent of sparks and burning embers that scoured the flesh. The air was too hot to breathe, searing the lungs. Streets became rivers of fire, the asphalt itself boiling and bubbling. People ran, their clothes and hair on fire, their screams lost in the all-consuming roar. They became living torches, their final agonies illuminated in the stark, shadowless light of the inferno. The firestorm created its own logic, its own physics. It swirled and leapt, defying all attempts to fight it. Fire crews were helpless, their hoses running dry or their water evaporating before it could even reach the flames. In the municipal library, a different kind of death was occurring. The fire, finding its way into the stacks, did not just burn books. It consumed memory itself. The Cairo Genizer, a priceless collection of ancient Jewish manuscripts and documents that had survived for a millennium in the dry air of Egypt, was turned to ash in minutes. Each burning page was a universe of history, language, and faith, extinguished forever. It was a microcosm of the entire event, the deliberate, systematic annihilation of a culture, not just its people or its buildings, but its very soul. By dawn, the firestorm had burned itself out, not for lack of fuel, but because there was simply nothing left to burn. The roar subsided, replaced by an eerie, crackling silence and the occasional groan of collapsing masonry. The survivors who crawled out into the light did not recognize their world. The old sturt was gone. In its place was a vast, smoldering plain of grey ash and blackened, skeletal stone. The intricate, living tapestry of half-timbered houses had been reduced to a geometric grid of foundation stones, like the outlines of graves. The heat had been so intense that it had fused rubble into strange, glassy formations. The air was thick with the sickly-sweet smell of burned wood and something else, a smell that would linger in the nostrils of the survivors for the rest of their lives. Over 1,000 people had died that night, many vaporized, leaving no trace. The firestorm of March 22 was not just another raid. It was the day the old Frankfurt was executed. It was the day the city's heart was torn out and incinerated, leaving behind only a ghost, a scar, and a silence heavier than any bomb. The firestorm of March 22 did not mark an end, but a terrible transition. It was the moment the war against Frankfurt shed its last vestige of strategic pretension. The target was no longer an industry, a railway yard, or even the historic city center, for that was already a smoldering grave. The target was now the very concept of Frankfurt as a living, functioning entity. The goal was systemic annihilation. This was the final, logical, and most horrifying phase, total war, waged not against an army, but against the city's atmosphere, its infrastructure, its will, and its future. In the wake of the firestorm, a new normal descended, a state of existence more bleak than any that had come before. The picturesque ruins of the old Stadt cooled into a grotesque, monolithic tombstone. But life, in a perverse, stubborn form, went on. The city's population now lived like vermin in a shattered hive. They inhabited cellars beneath mountains of rubble, their homes defined by which walls were still standing. They collected rainwater in buckets and scoured the countryside for scraps of food. The once proud cityscape was now a labyrinth of narrow paths cleared through the debris, each route memorized to avoid unstable piles of stone and the hidden, reeking corpses beneath. The smell was a permanent, suffocating presence, a cocktail of wet ash, pulverized brick, and the pervasive, sweet rotten odor of death that no breeze could ever fully dispel. The Allied bombing strategy evolved to meet this new, absolute objective. The raids continued with a relentless, grinding frequency. The calendar of terror for the remainder of 1944 became a numbing litany of destruction. September 12 stood out not for the size of the planes, but for the nature of their cargo. On that night, the bombing command of the RAF released a new kind of hell over Frankfurt's industrial districts. They did not drop a few hundred large bombs, they unleashed a swarm. 400,000 incendiary devices fell from the sky. This was not a bombing run, it was a meteorological event. It was a blizzard of fire. Each bomb was small, but together they represented a calculated effort to saturate every square meter, to leave no corner, no machine shop, no warehouse, no railway spur untouched by flame. The philosophy was one of area denial through pure, unadulterated terror. If a factory survived the initial blast, it would be found by a dozen of these white-hot needles, each capable of igniting anything it touched. As the year wore on, the character of the attacks shifted again, reflecting the changing tides of the wider war. With the German air defense in tatters and Allied air superiority absolute, the bombers could operate with near impunity. The raids became more clinical, more focused on strangling the city's last gasps. The de Havilland Mosquito, a fast, wooden-framed bomber, became a common sight. These were not the heavy, ponderous Lancasters of the Firestorm raids. They were predators, swift and agile, used for precision strikes and nuisance raids. Their attacks on December 22 and January 8, during the larger Battle of Berlin, were like the jabs of a boxer against a dazed opponent, stinging, exhausting blows meant to prevent any recovery, to keep the city perpetually off balance and bleeding. The targets were now the arteries of urban life. The raids deliberately sought out what remained of the power stations, the water filtration plants, the gas lines. They cratered the main roads and shattered the remaining railway lines leading out of the Hauptbahnhof. They destroyed the telephone exchange, severing the city's nervous system. The goal was to make Frankfurt uninhabitable not just through direct destruction, but through the collapse of all supporting systems. Disease began to stalk the ruins. Dysentery and typhus, born from contaminated water and the legions of rats that feasted on the unburied dead, became silent killers. A simple cut could lead to a fatal infection in a world without antiseptics or functioning hospitals. The very air was a poison, thick with the dust of pulverized brick and mortar, which settled in lungs, causing a hacking, bloody cough the survivors called dust lung. This was total war in its most distilled and savage form. It was no longer a battle between soldiers. It was a campaign to break the back of a city. Every burnt-out tram, every shattered sewer main, every collapsed bridge was a victory. Every child sick with fever, every mother scrounging for a potato in the frozen earth, was a strategic objective achieved. The high-altitude planners, looking at their maps and their bomb damage assessment photographs, saw a target set being systematically degraded. On the ground, the people of Frankfurt experienced it as the slow, agonizing death of their world. The bombs had taken their homes, their history, and their loved ones. Now, in this final chapter, they were taking the future. The lights were out, the water was foul, the streets were graves, and the sky, always the sky, belonged to the enemy. The war had entered the cellar, the kitchen, the sickbed. There was no front line anymore. The entire city was the front line, and surrender was not an option offered to civilians. There was only the wait, the enduring, and the hope, growing fainter with each passing day, that something, somehow, might survive. The silence, when it finally came, was the first true sound of peace. It was not the stunned, broken silence that followed a major raid, pregnant with the crackle of flames and the screams of the wounded. This was a deep, hollow, and absolute silence. The air raid sirens, for the first time in years, were mute. The endless, grinding drone of enemy aircraft had vanished from the sky. The crump of distant explosions, a sound so constant it had become the city's heartbeat, had ceased. In the spring of 1945, the war did not end with a bang in Frankfurt, but with a profound and unsettling quiet. The storm was over. All that remained were the ashes. The city that emerged from this silence was unrecognizable. It was a geological formation of man-made ruin. The vibrant, living organism of 1939 had been petrified into a vast, grey landscape. Mountains of rubble, some several stories high, defined the new skyline. The intricate web of streets was gone, buried under a uniform, chaotic blanket of destruction. To walk through this wasteland was to navigate a graveyard where the tombstones were the shattered remnants of daily life, a child's charred doll, a twisted bicycle frame, a single, mud-caked book, the scorched skeleton of a tramcar. The iconic half-timbered houses, the soul of the old Frankfurt, were almost entirely erased. Where the Romaburg had stood, there was now a flat, open space of ash and fragmented stone, the ghost of a square. The cathedral was a scorched shell, its spire a miracle of stubborn defiance against the forces that had sought to level everything. The smell was the same as it had been for months, but now it was permanent, baked into the very earth, the smell of wet ash, powdered brick, and decay. Into this landscape of the dead came the living. They were ghosts themselves, pale and hollow-eyed, emerging from cellars and bunkers. They moved slowly, their movements those of automatons, their faces masks of exhaustion and trauma. Their task was Herculean in its scale and its hopelessness. It was called traumarabate, rubble work. With bare hands, buckets, and a desperate, weary patience, they began the process of sifting through the millions of tons of debris. They formed human chains, passing hand to hand the broken bricks that had once been their homes, their schools, their shops. They stacked the reusable stones into neat piles, a futile gesture of order against the overwhelming chaos. Every cleared square meter was a victory. Every recognizable object pulled from the wreckage was a relic from a lost world. Amidst this vast, grey sea of ruin, a single, powerful symbol began to rise. It was not a skyscraper or a new government building. It was the Paulskirche, the Church of St. Paul. Its shell, like almost everything else, was burnt out and damaged. But it was chosen. It was chosen not first for its religious significance, but for its political history. It was within these neoclassical walls that the first freely elected German parliament had convened in 1848, a bold, if failed, experiment in democracy. Its reconstruction was the first major act in the new Frankfurt. It was not rebuilt to its former ornate glory, but in a stark, simplified historical style. Its plain, whitewashed interior was a blank slate, a deliberate rejection of the ornate nationalism that had led to the catastrophe. The Paulskirche was no longer just a church, it was a promise. It was a statement that from the ashes of total war, the only thing worth rebuilding was the idea of peace and democracy. This act of preservation stood in stark contrast to the prevailing mood of the time. The dominant philosophy was not restoration, but eradication. The old was tainted, associated with the path that had led to Nazism and destruction. The future was modern, clean, and forward-looking. Vast swathes of the historic city plan were swept away, not by bombs this time, but by bulldozers and urban planners. Wide, car-friendly avenues replaced the intimate, winding medieval lanes. Simple, functional, concrete and glass buildings rose where the ornate, crooked patchwork houses had once stood. The new Frankfurt was being built, but it was a different city. A city with amnesia, deliberately turning its back on the ghost that lay beneath its foundations. The final, chilling arithmetic of the campaign could now be tallied. The cost was 5,500 lives, a number that could not convey the individual agonies, the families erased, the stories cut short. The weight of the attack was 12,197 tons of American explosives and 15,948 tons of British bombs, a dry statistic that belied the apocalyptic force that had reshaped the very topography of the city. Their mission, from the failed first strike in 1942 to the final, crushing blows of 1945, was ultimately a success. The industrial and logistical heart of the region had been pummeled into irrelevance. The German war machine had been denied a crucial hub. But standing in the new Frankfurt, between the stark modernism of the rebuilt city and the solemn, simplified dignity of the Paulskirche, the victory felt Pyrrhic. The Allies had destroyed a city to save it from an ideology, and in the process, they had annihilated a priceless, irreplaceable piece of European heritage. The ashes of history were not just the powdered brick and burnt timber. They were the lost culture, the vanished beauty, the collective memory housed in the ancient beams of the old Stadt. The new city was a phoenix, yes, but one that had risen without many of its most beautiful feathers. The silence of peace was heavy with the echo of what was gone, a reminder that some wounds, even when healed, leave scars that last for generations. The storm was over, but the landscape it left behind would forever bear its mark.